first part of our weekly Q&A, where we will start off your weekend hopefully on the right track with Friday evening Friendly Neighborhood History live Q&A. Ask me anything history, social studies related. For the next hour or so, I'm going to be bringing you some quality, at least I hope, quality historical content based on the topics and comments and questions that you guys want to ask about history, social studies, geopolitics, past and present, and any other feature or topic that you want to enjoy or indulge in. I am here to discuss the humanities and social studies and social sciences with you. We do this every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as well as on Saturday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then Sunday will be our live stream lecture at 4 p.m. I actually haven't chosen our topic, but that is a Sunday afternoon where you guys can join me for some history, where I will be discussing and talking about a particular historical topic that I find to be particularly interesting or fascinating, and we'll be discussing the history of it with all of you. I'm trying to figure out exactly what I want to talk about. Maybe I'll talk about several topics. Sometimes I only do one, but usually I only get to one because there's just so much fascinating history and information around a particular topic that sometimes that's all I can do is just an hour of discussing one topic or another. Yes. But we are here live in our usual live stream Friday and Saturday night, where we will be answering any questions, comments, or topics you have related to social studies and history. For the next hour or so, I will be bringing you hopefully some good answers to some really good historical topics and questions. So please feel free to like and subscribe. Follow the social media handles put in our chat by my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny. We just went live on Substack. I published my first blog post there yesterday about the history of Boxing Day, December 26th, the day after Christmas, a very popular holiday in the UK and many of its affiliate commonwealths of the Angloid world. So please show some love to my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, who put the social media handles as well as that Substack link in the chat. Please join us there for everything. My pinned message is the social media handles. Follow us on Instagram, X, and Facebook for updates and things like that. We also have a Rumble where we update and put some videos from time to time. But after you do that, feel free to just pull up a chair, enjoy, relax, have some coffee or something else that you would like to drink, something to keep you warm on this wintry night. Don't know how cold it is where you are, but I'm assuming it's colder than it would be in July. So just enjoy the history. Drop a comment or topic or question you would like to ask in the chat, and I will get to it in a timely manner. And again, we do this every Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and Saturdays at 7 as well. And we just bring you 2 hours. Start your weekend off the right way on Fridays and follow it up on Saturdays with some more history and quality content. Ask me anything about social studies, history, or humanities. We've been doing this since the summer. This channel has been going since February. We're going to do we're coming up on a year of this channel, and we have gotten so much wonderful support and all of that wonderful stuff. So please consider liking and subscribing. If you like and subscribe, you are officially a Friendly Neighborhood Historian, and we are planning something very special for all of our subscribers when we get to a year anniversary. So really looking forward to that. So we will be... but we started off the live streams in the summer, and we really found them to be very enjoyable. We did Saturday afternoons Q&A. People would come and ask really good history questions, and eventually people were sad to see it only be once a weekend, so we decided to do Saturdays and Sundays. So we would do Saturday and Sunday afternoon Q&As, and eventually I realized that all the topics I wanted to talk about in the Q&A I could never quite get to. So I decided to branch out, and starting in the middle of the fall, we started doing 3 live streams. So Friday night, Saturday night Q&As, and Sunday live stream lectures, which will hopefully eventually one day evolve into the Friendly Neighborhood History Podcast. I'm in the process of updating my equipment. I've got a microphone that I'm using that hopefully provides a more enjoyable form of my voice rather than me just speaking into an iPhone microphone. I have a new iPhone that probably improves the audio and visual quality. And of course, I have my nice new lighting system that will keep me illuminated even as it gets darker and darker, because it's dark here already, as I know it's probably dark where you are right now. So please enjoy the next hour or so where I will be interacting with the chat, answering your questions, and discussing history, hopefully in a friendly neighborhood manner. And if you want to be a friendly neighborhood historian, it's as easy as liking and subscribing and following me on those social media handles. And we had a goal. We had a Legion, 6,000 by the end of the year. I don't know that we're going to get there, but we're over 5,800 subscribers. And to do that in just not about 10 months' time, since February, we started President's Day weekend. We'll be celebrating President's Day weekend, our anniversary, come this February, with some special live stream Q&As and videos and things like that. Just the support, the feedback, the love, and the hate, which has only made me better. I really appreciate all the interactions and the community that we've been able to build here. Friendly Neighborhood Historians. So And make sure again to show some love to Simon the Bunny, who works so hard on everything for the channel and does a great job of posting updates and monitoring the chat and is here almost without fail. So I really, really appreciate that. So let's see here. I'm going to be looking at the chat and answering questions and comments and topics. So anything you want to discuss history based, I will be doing. I'm going to go all the way back. And by the way, I hope everybody had a wonderful Christmas and enjoyed their holidays. Got some nice, did not get coal in their stocking, but got some nice treats from St. Nicholas, who supposedly, according to legend, used to throw toys and goodies into stockings and stuff like that. And that's where the tradition of putting up stockings for old St. Nicholas, which the Dutch called Sinterklaas, and of course we call Santa Claus, started. Hopefully you all got some enjoyable presents, gave some good things, found a good charity to donate to or something in that manner, and that you all had a very blessed and wonderful Christmas. I know I did. I really enjoyed my Christmas. And technically, for some people, Christmas continues for 12 days as people continue to celebrate all the way to what is known as Epiphany, which is supposedly the presentation and naming of the baby Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem. It is also supposedly the day when the three kings visited him. In Latin culture, it's called Dia de los Tres Reyes, and it comes on January 6th. So that's technically the end of the Christmas season. Yuletide celebrations, ancient winter solstices, and celebrations by Northern European groups such as the Scandinavian, the Norse, and the German barbarian tribes that were never fully conquered by the Romans. Those groups which maintained their traditions, known as the Yuletide season, those continued for weeks at a time. So Christmas was never meant to be, even in its most ancient form, a single day of celebration, but a festival that would last for multiple days on end. And it was that way in medieval Europe. It's that way with the 12 days of Christmas. So hopefully you are all enjoying the Christmas or Yuletide season. And of course, also, if you are celebrating Hanukkah, I wish you a very happy Hanukkah. That'll be continuing for another week, I think, until the 2nd. And I have made a history of Hanukkah and a history of Christmas video, so please go check that out when you can. So I'm just going through the chat here and seeing if we've got some questions here. Simon and Global always having some great conversations. Global, I always appreciate your comments because they're always so deep and insightful. Hello, Russian. Great to see you. Guyan is asking, what was your master's thesis on? Any time period or culture you are personally obsessed with? Well, I'm primarily obsessed with Russian history. I'm a Russian historian primarily. That's my focus and the main drive of my scholarship and work. So I really enjoy learning about Russian history. My master's thesis was technically about Russian history. It was about the British occupation of Afghanistan and a competition known as the Great Game in the 19th century between the British and the Russians for control and dominance of Afghanistan, South Asia. The British were terrified that the Russians would try to take India, and the Russians were terrified that the British would invade them at any time. And this led to kind of a series of proxy wars in Afghanistan and Iran, where both sides were trying to hold off each other in what could be called the first Cold War ever. And so I'm obsessed with Russian history. I'm obsessed with Eastern European history, especially in the more contemporary last 250 years. And so part of that obviously motivated me towards writing my master's thesis about the Great Game. But I tend to become really obsessed with whatever history I'm learning about. So so in the last year or two, I've become more interested in Eastern history and learned more about Asian history and things like that. And I'm really fascinated by that. And I think it's just an obsession with the human condition and the behavior of human beings. And I think that's what really motivates me when it comes to things like history. I think history tells us the story of the human condition. And so because I really love studying about humanity, psychology really interests me, things like that. That is my favorite subject, and my favorite subject and time period often tends to be the period I'm learning about. And I tend to obsess about any historical period that I find particularly interesting. So from Italy, great to see you. I don't know if you switched sides, but I'm so glad you're here. The old days, they would wake in the middle of the night to stoke the fires. Yes, that's very true. And yes, a lot of people, there's more influence from a word of mouth history global because more and more people are getting, just like they get their news today. People hear things and then they think that it's true. They don't verify it. And that has not just started recently. That word of mouth was common in medieval, ancient, and the classical world when word of mouth was the most reliable and common way for people to communicate. It's just right now it happens a lot more quickly. Who has more dominance now in Afghanistan, Russia or UK? Simplistic view. Yeah, now I don't think either side has any particular level of dominance. I think if you study the Afghan people themselves and their history, you will find that the most unifying and important thing to an Afghan has always been Islam, particularly Sunni Islam, which is very popular there. And the Pushtun tribe that united all of the Afghans and set up the first king in 1747. The modern state of Afghanistan did not exist until 1747. It was significantly influenced by its religious ties. And so the only thing that has connected those different tribes who have often been warring with each other for thousands of years has been Sunni Islam. Um, Let me see. Definitely, and as fake news and AI takes over and people stop reading printed press books and word of mouth, yes, I think that we're in an age now, Simon, where we're not dealing with history in the terms of the way that we would deal with, or sorry, not history, but the way media. We don't deal with news in the classic sense of watching the news or reading newspapers or things like that. People may do that, or they may read articles here or there, but I think generally speaking, nowadays people tend to be more obsessed with history in terms of or sorry, news and media in terms of community news. So I think that the influence of social media, people knew things on social media on election night here in the United States before it broke on CNN, Fox, or CBS. So people tend to have more and more of an influence from social media and other media platforms than they do from their own. From the own classical sources. So I think we're at a historical watershed now where classical media means are becoming less and less common, and people are relying more and more on on community news, communal ways of learning, and things like that. And so we're in a period where we're relying less on printed material and more on community news that we can get at breaking times. Now that community news tends to rely on social media news and things like that, tends to rely on printed sources, but they tend to get updates and news reports more quickly because we live in a digital age where information is readily available at the tips of our fingers for our cell phones and things like that. So I think, Simon, we're at a precipice where media is changing and the way we interact with media is going from classical to more community news based on social media. Guyan, do you know anything about Ilya Muromets? I played Battlefield 1, and the Russian heavy bomber was called the Muromets, named after some sort of fabled Russian knight. I don't know a lot about that. I know the Russians love to name their places, like Nevsky Plaza in St. Petersburg, one of the most important plazas where the Russian Revolution actually started, is named after Alexander Nevsky, who was a 10th century Russian or Lithuanian prince who defeated German invaders and kept basically Russia from becoming Catholic. There are others. There's this ancient history of these famous knights throughout Russian history that have been loyal to the Orthodox way of life and to the Tsar and to Russian chauvinism and imperialism. So I don't know a lot about where Ilya Muromets, but I would imagine he is one of those medieval knights, probably a fighter of the Mongols or the Turks, who were the sworn enemies of the Russians for a long time, who did his absolute best to keep Russia safe and independent and free, and that's why they would name their bombers after them. Melinda, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Oh, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, Underboss. It's so great to see you. I'm so glad you're here. Yes, trying to spit as much information as I can. So yeah, great to see you all. Yeah. Let me see. What was I saying? Yep, I dedicate hours, but so do you, Simon. So yes, like Simon is saying, please consider liking and subscribing, getting this channel going, getting us towards that path of monetization. We're on the right path. We're moving in the right directions, and you guys are a huge part of that. Your interactions in the community, you watching the short form and long form videos, and also coming here to the live streams, telling everybody about it, spreading the word. Following me on social media. We are growing and we are building, and I really, really love to see it. I would have imagined back in February when we started all of this, and we were just talking about casual history and whatever came to my mind, I tried to make a video out of, and I didn't know anything about producing videos and content. I had no idea we'd get to 5,800 subscribers by the end of the year, and would have so many wonderful, friendly neighborhood historians. It's really been really amazing. Also, I heard Russian literature is dense and sad. I read Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and it was one of the best novels. Yeah, Russian novels and literature is very powerful and very deep, and obviously the two titans of that are Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but there's others like Turgenev, and of course Pasternak and Dr. Zhivago. The Russians are known for their novels being very deep, very rich, but also very saddening, very realistic. They don't like to be optimistic in their writing, especially people like Dostoevsky, who really point out the difficulties of life and how strained life is. And yes, Russian novels and novelists tend to write extremely long books, copious amounts of detail, very beautiful, very deep, very enriching, very philosophical, but a lot of sad and terrible things happen throughout them. And you really have to walk through this difficult path with them until you get to the end. And there's some joy and happiness there, such as in The Brothers Karamazov, which is considered by many to be the greatest novel ever written, Dostoevsky's work. Of course, Anna Karenina is one of the greatest tragedies ever written, and it's written in the style of the 19th century romantic novels like Jane Austen's or Emily Bronte or Charlotte Bronte, but it has a much sadder ending with Tolstoy's work, probably his most famous. Of course, there's also War and Peace, which is considered by many to be the greatest novel ever written, and is probably the longest novel ever written. So, yeah, Russian novels, Russian literature can be quite dense and deep. And as a Russian historian, and this is something that I do whenever I'm studying a particular history, you have to become baked into the culture. You have to learn about the food. You have to learn about the religion. You have to learn about the literature. And as a Russian historian, eventually I'm going to have to learn the language for my doctorate, because studies of primary sources and archives and places like that are going to be really, really important for learning about as much history as possible. So in order to become a consummate historian, I would encourage anyone to become a consummate a consumer of the culture of those people. So learn their literature, learn their language, learn their customs and practices and traditions, learn about why they believe in a particular religion. You don't have to believe in that religion, but learn what their religion is telling you about their society and their culture and the development of their way of life. So stuff like that's really important. Let's see. Professor is live. Come sit. Yes. Yeah. Well, I like to sit Indian. It's called crisscross applesauce. We don't use Indian style anymore because it's supposedly offensive to Native Americans, but I love to sit that way sometimes. And it is the pins and needles sitting. So, Nazino Island. I don't know about that. What about? Tell me about Nazino Island, Triglyceride. Something we love to do here on the channel is I love to learn from the people who come and join us and share information, and it really, really is enjoyable just to hear everybody's perspectives and what they're doing. Um, Thank you, Underboss. I appreciate you doing that. Yes, I look less homeless tonight. It's probably the new lighting, the microphone, all of that stuff. And yep, we're trying to be as open-minded as we possibly can be, and to share important information with as many people as possible. And yes, we're aiming for 6,000. Um, yeah, that's going to be interesting. When do we actually get to 6,000? I mean, we could do a bum's rush and get through it and get there by December 31st by New Year's. That would be really, really awesome. I don't see that necessarily happening, but I'm perfectly okay with that. That was our original goal, but we got so many thousands in just a few months. I'm thinking that we'll get there by the end of January. That's my guess. Um, yeah, I don't. Well, the thing is, Running Man, you may not care about the religion, and the religion, you may not believe in the religion, but in order to learn the culture and history of a particular group of people, one of the most important things about them, and one of the most formative things about their history and the development of their society is their religion. So that would be learning, why do they believe a certain way? Why do they act a certain way? You can't tell the story of Russia, for instance, without learning about the Russian Orthodox Church and its vast amount of influence on the development of Russian society and politics. To this day, Russia's political aims and actions, such as Putin's actions, have been highly motivated by their religious beliefs, by this sense of spiritual nationalism that God has set Russia as a distinct and unique place. And one of the biggest condemnations of Western society made by Putin and the Russian nationalists is that the West has become morally decrepit, it has abandoned God, and it has become too secular, and therefore deserves the condemnation that it gets. That's obviously not my opinion. I think that's a misappropriation of Orthodox Christian religion, but it is the way religion has influenced and continues to influence the development of a society. And development of a society, cultural understandings are all based in history. And the Russians did not just wake up one night and decide to have this view about the world. They developed this view of the world over time. And so That and part of that is because of how deeply entrenched their religion was. A lot of people thought that during the time of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, that Christianity had died out in Russia and was completely and was lost, and all of a sudden, hiding in the shadows, who had suffered different types of persecution to varying degrees after the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the Western Bloc and the end of the Cold War, or Eastern Bloc, I should say, you had the emergence of millions of Christians, Catholic and Orthodox and Protestant, who had been basically hiding their beliefs and had to drive the churches underground, or at least deal with difficult consequences for being publicly affirmed in their faith. And that happened all throughout Eastern Europe, showing that the religious ties to the culture were deeper than the new political ties, which insisted on a more atheistic way of looking at the world, or at least a more, not even, I wouldn't even call it atheistic, but a worshiping of the state, a statism that denied religious autonomy, religious authority, or religious influence. And you can't just take that away from people when people have been used to it for so long. So I think that a huge reason, Running Man, that Russia has developed the way it has is because of those religious motifs. There's something that is deeper to these people than just simply their beliefs um, in a political system. So when you're studying a culture, you have to study its religion, even if their religion is you don't believe it's correct. The Russian Hunger Games at Nazino. I'll have to read about that. That sounds like something that would happen. If anyone would have a Hunger Games, it would be the Russians. Um, have you met a historian from a different language and understand a difference? Not personally. I haven't. I mean, I've dealt with historians of different stripes and educations, but not of a different language and culture from a different area of the world. Yep. Thanks, Rodolfo. I am going to give up the gap eventually, and when I get my goal is to get monetized so I can fix my teeth. There. That is why. That's my elaborate scheme. So you guys are all helping me fix my teeth. If you use the channel name in other chats, you could advertise. I could. I don't like to. I don't go into other chats or do other live streams. I do on social media interact with certain history groups and make them aware about what we do here and what we're doing recently, and about live streams and Q&As and stuff like that. Um, yeah, I would. I mean, I would have to communicate with other channels and get that message across. I'll have to do that from Canada. Yes, Jenna, I definitely am saying that. Uh, Context is essential to understanding cultural context, social context, religious context, and of course, historical context, because people just don't wake up and have a certain view or idea out of nowhere. They develop these views over time. Which big historical person do you think had the best sense of humor that wasn't linked to comedy? Simon, I think Lincoln was really good at telling anecdotes and he loved to tell stories and jokes. And I think that Lincoln had this disarming quality about him where he's dealing, if you look at Lincoln, ironically and paradoxically, he's dealing with the most difficult time in American history, with the most fractious time in American history. And yet he has this wonderful sense of humor. He's very approachable, very genial, and very down to earth in a way that a lot of people liked at that time period, because 19th century Americans really cared about how someone appealed to the common man. This is the age of Jackson. This is the Jacksonian era, when your common man appeal and your ability to talk to normal people, even if you're a politician, really matters a lot. And Lincoln had this ability and this dynamism about him. He was an incredible speaker. He was incredibly talented, but he was also able to come across as very likable and friendly. There we go. There's with the channel drop title, but very, very funny. Um, had some really great stories. Till next year, Underboss. Global, what about Mark Twain? What have you got about Mark Twain? I don't. America's Best Writer, all of that stuff. Metric Sphinx, good to see you. Thank you. I don't know who Sandra Bernhard is, so I'll go with that. Mr. Lewis, good to see you. Oh, Mark Twain's sense of humor. Yeah, there. That would be a great example of a writer with a sense of humor. I'm thinking of when I think of historical figures and things like that, I tend to think of leaders, and people who are movers and shakers. Not to say that Mark Twain isn't. Samuel Clemens was an extremely influential writer, and you can tell about that because people are still debating and arguing about his books and things like that. And I think that he obviously has an important part to play in the history of the United States. Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer being two of the most important novels and two of the most controversial novels in all of American history. But I wouldn't necessarily. I'd say he's one of the best when it comes to humor and things like that. but I wouldn't necessarily say he's as big of a shaker or as big of a historical figure as Lincoln. So Simon, I would have to say Lincoln had the best sense of humor. It's a great question. Um, no, Mysterious Stranger clay animation. That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm not huge on claymation and things like that, but if people enjoy it, then people enjoy it, and you can obviously learn from that. Um, Interesting. I'll have to watch that. Yeah, I mean, I love Mark Twain's wit. I love his humor. People like him, Oscar Wilde, W.C. Fields. If you just read some of their quotes, you'll just laugh uproariously because they're quite brilliant and quite deep. So yeah, really enjoyable people. And if you find what I'm talking about to be enjoyable, please consider liking and subscribing, joining the friendly neighborhood historians, checking out the short and long form content that we drop all the time. We're going to be here for another half hour or so, answering questions and talking to you guys about history. So any comments or topics about social studies that you guys want to bring up, please be sure to do so. Oh, that's interesting, Simon. So you're a leap year baby. That's really, really cool. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, yeah, you celebrate either on the 28th or the 1st of March on other years, I'm assuming. But anyways, yeah, I appreciate that, Simon. Something we do hear a lot on the channel is we don't like to get too personal or too involved with our personal details. Simon doesn't even know my name. People can piece together certain bits of information. For a while, I didn't want to say that I was an American, but I let it slip in a couple of comments that I made, and I figured the United States is big enough and has enough people in it that I don't necessarily have to. Um, I don't necessarily have to. What's the word? Mind if people know that I'm an American. People can guess where I am. People don't know exactly where I am or things like that. And I always put Eastern Standard Time because I think that's like the most definitive. That's not doesn't mean I'm in the Eastern Time Zone in the United States, but it could. Um, yeah. Well, let's see. What you like the curtain rods? Yeah, I really like these curtains and these backgrounds. Simon was mentioning that I live in kind of a British house, so I really kind of enjoy that. That more European style to my decor and things like that, and that's what I'm kind of going for. And I mean, I'm a European historian primarily, and that's my expertise. So it kind of fits uh, how I live and where I live. So, what made Picasso so influential? So I would say that Picasso is extremely influential because Picasso has an he is revolutionizing art and he's starting a new period of art. Now, I'm not an art historian, but I'll do my best to explain as much as I can here. Basically, what Picasso does in the Cubist movement is he takes the modern and post impressionist periods and gives them new light and new vision. His work is extraordinarily vivid and it's kind of all over the place and it's broken apart and all of that stuff. That's why it's called cubic. But it's basically this new interpretation of art that people didn't have before, and they really really enjoy it, and they really really find it fascinating. Um, and I think in the same way that Van Gogh's art was different and evocative and colorful and vibrant and intense, I think Picasso's work is just as intense and just as evocative. And the fact that he painted so prolifically for so long, so many decades of Picasso producing sketches and diagrams and paintings, and the fact that his work changed through the years and adapted to the culture that he was in just shows how much Picasso was affected by the history going on around him. Of course, the best example of this is Guernica, where he depicts the brutality and terror and death and destruction of the Spanish Civil War. And perhaps anyone who is teaching or learning about the Spanish Civil War will learn about Guernica because Guernica was that important in the development of the Spanish Civil War and the cultural response to it. And if you think of the Spanish Civil War as a brutal and awful account, time in Spain's history, which it certainly was, you're going to think of Guernica and Picasso's incredible painting there. So, what made Picasso so influential? I think his cultural understanding, his daringness, his dynamism, and his longevity are some of the things. So, ever happy, great to see you. I'm so glad you're here. What is the story you would tell if someone asked you the most interesting history story that you know? I've got to go with Napoleon's return. So Napoleon Bonaparte is defeated by the Russians in 1813, 1814, and he's forced into exile on Elba, which is an island off the coast of Italy. And he basically sets it up and becomes like a mini emperor there. And he basically just runs the society there. He's under basically kind of a house arrest by the British, but he's able to actually run the affairs of the island. He cleans up their sanitation. He cleans up their public works. He creates a police force. He does all of these really interesting things. And while this is happening, the different European powers are trying to reorder Europe. And it's called the Congress of Vienna. And basically, how do we reestablish France? What will France look like now that Bonaparte is gone? And what is Europe going to look like for the next foreseeable future? Clemens von Metternich, who was an Austrian politician working for the Austrian emperor, is trying, and a bunch of other people are trying to put the pieces back together and make Europe look something manageable and conservative and run by monarchs and nobility and the aristocracy. Meanwhile, Napoleon basically is able to escape at the dead of night when basically when the soldiers aren't looking, but risking his own life to do so. And he returns to France, and he decides he has no army, he has no guidance, he is down and out on his luck, and he is an enemy of the French state. And that is what the restored French constitutional monarchy under Louis XVII, for instance, is saying basically. So Napoleon is a big threat to Spain, to France's safety, and its standing amongst these other Europeans. So even him being in France is dangerous for the French, and he is seen as an enemy of the state. So when he returns and lands on the shore, I believe in Toulouse, he is basically greeted by a contingent of soldiers who are going to arrest him, and Napoleon rips open his coat and with his chest exposed yells, "I am your emperor, will you strike me?" And the soldiers are so moved by his daring boldness that they actually abandon their posts and rally around him. And he is able to actually build a contingent army again. And while the Europeans are mobilizing, he strikes and is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by uh, the Duke of Wellington, and of course, Field Marshal Blücher. And this is one of the biggest defeats of Napoleon's life. And he is finally exiled to basically a very tiny island, St. Helena in the Atlantic, which ends any chance of him returning. But Napoleon's daring escape, return, and his willingness to risk his own life and risk the life of France shows his hubris, but also his courage and his great leadership abilities. So I love that story. I love the fact that Napoleon would be so bold as to do that. I love any historical story that involves a lot of guts and involves someone standing up to a giant system that is being organized against them. So it's one of my favorite stories in history. It's one of many, that's for sure. Um, what historical source building do you wish still existed? The Library of Alexandria. No question about it. If the Library of Alexandria had not been destroyed by the Umayyads in the 7th century AD, we would have so many ancient sources. Our learning would be so advanced, and our understanding of the ancient world would be far more complete, and our history wouldn't be pieced together so much. We would have far more understanding of Greco-Roman and Egyptian culture, language, and art, that our understanding and knowledge of the ancient world would be astronomically improved. We would also have a better understanding of the Judeo-Christian narratives and the creation of the three major religions. I think Islam would have a far better and much more, although the golden age of Islam obviously happens a few centuries later, but I think Islam would have a far better reputation when it came to the arts and literature that they preserve the Library of Alexandria. I think its destruction is a very sad moment in history, and I wish it still existed and people could still visit it. Who knows what its modern and more updated forms would look like, and who knows how it would be used as a political tool throughout history because of all of the knowledge and access there. Can you see the British imperializing and colonizing Egypt and then setting up the Library of Alexandria, and how that would play in the role of their colonization as a place of learning and study for British scholarship? Um, what do I think of Salvador Dali? So very fascinating guy. Once again, like Picasso, lived a long time, extremely prolific. I love the clock faces. I forget what it's called, but you guys probably know what I'm talking about. I think he's an incredible artist. I love art, by the way. I can't draw or paint to save my life, but I really enjoy and appreciate looking at art and what it evokes emotionally, and also how it impacts people. And again, if you're going to study history and you're going to study culture of a certain place, any place in particular, look at their art, look at their artists, look at the way they depict art. Are they more into pottery? Are they more into painting? Why? Why is sculpture so important to Renaissance Italian artists, especially the early ones like Donatello and Michelangelo, but it is less important to the French artists like Gauguin and Cézanne, Degas an exception, or of course Van Gogh. And the Dutch painters all seem to love painting. So you can learn a lot about history based on the medium of art that a particular society chooses to use. but also you can learn a lot about history through what the art is doing and depicting. And a lot of historical art is depicted. Of course, none more famous than biblical stories, but you also have Goya's Night of Distress, where the Spanish rebels are killed by the French Fusiliers when Napoleon was fighting against the Spanish in the Peninsular War. So stuff like that. I really do like Salvador Dali. I think that he's a complex person. I think he has a lot of shortcomings. He was kind of all over the place, but he had some sympathies for fascism and the Nazis that obviously no one can excuse. But a really interesting guy nonetheless. Let's ask this: what do you think when Putin is gone? Jinping and Trump. I don't know what you mean, Rick. I think you might want to rephrase that question, but it sounds interesting. And yes, if you have a question, drop it in the chat. Consider liking and subscribing if you like my answers, or even if you disagree with my answers. Just stay and enjoy, talk, drop some topics you would like to discuss. That's what we do here every Friday and Saturday night on the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. Rick, it's actually not true that Napoleon was a midget. He wasn't. I mean, even if he was as short as the rumors are, I have an entire video about why this is a historical myth. I do historical myth videos on the channel all the time. That's not technically true. Even if he was as short as the British want us to think he wasn't a midget. The idea that Napoleon was short comes from British cartoons, which became political cartoons, which became really popular in the late 18th and early 19th century. So they were getting popular just in time for people to really bag on their enemies. And Napoleon was England's greatest enemy at the time. So a lot of their art and political humor was aimed, once again, art has this cultural and political impact. It was aimed at degrading Napoleon and making him the enemy. And the best way to dehumanize him is to make him as small as possible. So their depictions of Napoleon make him shorter than he actually was. Napoleon is often depicted as small because of this in art going forward. Napoleon was probably about 5'6" or 5'7", which isn't that tall, but was the average adult male height at that time. Throughout human history, human beings have been shorter than they are now. Nutrition and proper medical care has allowed humans to grow at a greater rate and become taller than they were before. Just as people have lived longer because of modern medicine, and that modern medicine and access to nutrition and medical care have also made it easier for humans to grow taller and become healthier. So Napoleon is an example of a historical myth where the myth becomes the history and the actual history is replaced. Napoleon was average adult height for the most part, especially in that time period when everybody was shorter than they are now. The idea that Napoleon, who was this amazing conqueror and great general, wasn't an intimidatingly tall, striking figure like William Wallace was supposedly, the ancient Scottish warrior, just shows how important it is for people to conceive of their military leaders as tall, imposing, handsome, or beautiful figures like Caesar or Alexander the Great, who was always depicted as youthful, vibrant, and good-looking. So the fact that Napoleon was not any of these things just shows how much people rely on their leaders and generals and conquerors, especially their successful conquerors, to be these intimidating figures when that's not necessarily the case. And again, history tells us about what happened, but it also tells us about who we are as people. And I think it's very interesting that the victors write the history, as we often know. The British won that war, so they were able to write the history around the height of Napoleon, which shows how petty the hatred of Napoleon got to be. So, Janet, Napoleon was sent to Alba originally. He returned, and then he was exiled again to Saint Helen because he was not trusted, and he died down the hall from his wife Josephine. What is your opinion on King Philip? Do you mean Metacomet, the Indian chief of the Wampanoag people who fought against the colonists in the 1670s, or King Philip Augustus, the French king who defeated the English and reclaimed most of France's land and is often considered the greatest French monarch? Or do you mean Philippe II of Spain, who was married to Queen Mary I, and after she died, turned on her half-sister Elizabeth and raised the Spanish Armada to destroy the English and was defeated thanks to the weather and the English fire ships? What does it take to become king? Stings. What does it take to become king, even though you're not technically king yet? Well, typically in history, a king is somebody who rules over a certain area and land. In ancient history, in Mesopotamia, the earliest times of Egypt, and of course in in Greece, a king ruled over a city or a series of cities known as a city-state, which is basically as if a city acted as its own country. So imagine if New York and all of the boroughs and areas around New York, with millions of people there, was its own country, and the mayor of New York was the king of New York. That's how it would work. That's how city-states would work. So a king was someone who was able to rule over a city, supposedly had a divine right, meaning that the gods or God had approved of him and his regime, or her and her regime, if you're talking about a queen, and basically the Chinese called it the mandate of heaven, where basically the gods smiled on this ruler and everything went well because the gods had the favor. This ruler had the favor of the gods, and when his dynasty collapsed, it was because the blessings of heaven, the mandate of heaven had passed from him to someone else, so a new dynasty could take power. And if there were natural disasters or problems that even the king couldn't avoid, it was because the gods no longer favored him and he had to be overthrown. So you needed some divine sanction or approval from the gods or God to be a ruler. You needed to be able to control the military. You needed to be inspirational. Most of the first kings who were able to establish their countries were extraordinarily forceful and strong-willed, and were great leaders. And because they were great leaders and very forceful and strong, people listened to them and rallied around them. So you needed practical leadership skills, you needed religious approval, and you also needed to know how to govern effectively, either tyrannically or more benevolently. What's your opinion on Marcus Aurelius? Striggs, I believe that he's one of the greatest rulers. He's an example of somebody who had all of those things going for him. I think he's an excellent philosopher. I've read part of the Meditations. I think you might have the greatest ruler in human history who was also the greatest philosopher in human history. He's the only person who could possibly be both of those things. He was one of the best Roman emperors. He kept Rome safe. He stabilized it following its plague. He kept it wealthy and prosperous. If you want a vision of what the Pax Romana looked like and how Rome was so stable and secure, it's the time of Marcus Aurelius, where he was able to withstand natural disasters such as the Antonine Plague, while also defeating German barbarians all over the borders, keeping Rome safe and secure and prosperous and strong, while also penning some of the greatest philosophy of all time, being one of the most important Stoic philosophers. Always a popular read for people who are trying to become better. He's particularly popular with men, but also a very successful ruler and emperor. And like I said, he might be the only person in human history who could cross out those two boxes of being the greatest ruler of his land and also being the greatest philosopher. I don't think he's the greatest philosopher ever, nor do I think he's the best Roman emperor, but he's definitely in the top 5 of probably both. So let's see here. Melting clock faces. Yes, I love that painting. Drew's asking, have you ever heard the story or rumor of his penis? Are you referring to Napoleon? I know I don't want to talk too much about genitalia, but I know that Rasputin was mutilated by those who killed him, and his male part was later put on display for people to stare at, and it became one of his obsessions because a lot of the Russian nobility hated Rasputin because he was sleeping around with their wives supposedly and having these drunken orgies, which I tend to think are all exaggeratory and were ways to use to create hatred around him and kill him. But yeah, I have heard. I don't know about Napoleon's part. Do you think the Athenians and Spartans deserved to win the Greco-Persian Wars? Yes, because when the Greeks worked together, their military was better. If you compare the immortals in the Persian army, such as at Thermopylae, the Greek phalanx was so secure and such a strong fighting force that literally the only way the Persians could defeat the 300 Spartans and the 1,000 other Greeks who allied with them was by getting around them and surrounding them. They couldn't break down the phalanx because it was such an effective, it was basically a wall of soldiers moving forward. The way the Romans were able to get around the phalanx was through javelin throwing, because Roman soldiers almost always had a javelin that they could throw at their enemies. And so I think they deserved to win, and when the Greeks worked together, they were extraordinarily successful. The decline of the Greeks that was eventually swallowed up by Philip and later Alexander conquering and uniting them by force was when the Athenians and Spartans stopped working together, and you have the Peloponnesian Wars, and the fact that Sparta, which was far less artistic, far less philosophical, and far less interested in human freedom vis-a-vis democracy, won those wars is an indication of a dark age, a second dark age in Greek history before the rise of Alexander the Great. So something interesting there. Michelangelo's David sculpture was a message to future generations the moment before deciding to fight. Stone in hand, sleeve on shoulder. Yes, and it's also a callback to the ancient Greeks because David is actually in the style of the Greek god Apollo. I want to go to the Parthenon one day and the Acropolis. Yes, Fang, that's really cool. And if you like learning about the Acropolis, you might want to watch my video about how the Parthenon was destroyed. The Greeks actually voluntarily blew it up so that they would not allow the Turks during their revolution to actually get a hold of their ammunition. I saw a book the other day in a bookstore, and I really want to buy it now, about how the Greek Revolution, which was all based in Greek nationalism, created the nationalism of the 19th century because the Greeks are the first to gain their own nation state, gaining independence from the Turks, and that created the modern sense of nationalism that people both love and hate. And that nationalism spread to Italy, it spread to Czechoslovakia, it spread to Hungary, it spread to Germany, of course, in the late part of the 19th century. And it all started with the Greek Revolution. And during that Greek Revolution, they blew up one of their biggest national symbols just to not let the Turks get a hold of their ammunition. That is how hardcore they were in their revolution against the Turks and how much they hated them. Striggs, I love your questions. Thank you so much for asking all of these. Do you think Hammurabi or Gandhi made a larger impact on the patriarchy? I'm not sure about patriarchy. I don't know if you misspelled Gandhi and you meant Mahatma Gandhi. I'm not sure who you mean otherwise, but Hammurabi obviously creates a law code, a covenant between the people of Mesopotamia and their gods. And he is one of the first kings to start uniting all of the people. I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of Sargon of Akkad, who kind of ended the city-state system in Mesopotamia, which ended ancient Sumeria basically, and started to create this system that became known as the ancient Babylonian Empire, where you had a king ruling over a bunch of different cities and an established amount of land. And the first places you see that are in Egypt, and with people like Sargon of Akkad, Hammurabi, and then later on people like Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonians. Yeah. For his time, Janet, he was standard height. Why two French images, your main pick and the banner, D-Day landings and the Eiffel? Because I love, it's interesting. I didn't even make that connection. I wanted to pick two extremely historical significant things. I love France. I love French art. I love French architecture. Paris is the one city in the world I want to go more than anywhere else. So that's why I have the Eiffel Tower as my profile picture. The D-Day landings are just historically significant. I like to appeal. I think that when it comes to history, the easiest hot button topic that everybody knows something about is World War II. So I wanted to pick a common popular thing. And of course, I think the D-Day story is extremely interesting, especially when I consider that it's not just the one day of fighting at all of these beaches. It's actually a several months long campaign that took the Allies a long time to liberate Normandy and Paris from the Nazis. So yeah. Brandon, what up? Great to see you. So great to have you here. Do you think Philip II of Macedon was a genius for inventing a new battle technique involving the Sarissa pikes? I think he just improved upon the phalanx system, and then Alexander improved upon that. And Alexander, if you actually study it, wasn't just throwing soldiers in the phalanx at the enemy and having them charge. Something the Greeks struggled with at Thermopylae and against the Persians was because they weren't a united civilization and because they relied on different city-states, they oftentimes didn't have the manpower versus an empire like the Persians who could draw people from all over the place and create and assemble tens of thousands of soldiers easily. The Greeks had trouble assembling such massive numbers until Alexander united and Philip united all of them. So I think that Alexander's victories and successes were because of increased amounts of manpower and the ability to use them properly, such as when he created that ramp that basically destroyed the city of Tyre that no one thought could ever be conquered. I think it was. I don't know a lot. It's interesting, Simon. I know about Ansel Adams and Civil War photography. I don't know a lot about the history of photography. I know it's important in warfare, and media has changed the way people look at war. The ability for the Vietnam War to be televised allowed a lack of distrust to grow in America that led to the eventual end and cessation of that war. It would have been interesting to see, had there been such easy media access during World War II, what would have happened there. Who is your favorite historical photographer journalist? I've got to go with Ansel Adams on that one. I just think he's the pioneer. I think it's really genius what he did with the Civil War, and I think we can look at the Civil War as the first modern war because of the photography that's available. What was Jack the Ripper's purpose on a psychological level? I think he was just. I think he fits the profile. I do love true crime and stuff like this, and I've talked about Jack the Ripper before on the channel. I think just like H. Holmes, who was a contemporary serial killer who killed a lot more people here in the United States, I think Jack the Ripper had some sort of psychological obsession with that. Seems to have conflated violence with sex. Most of his victims were sex workers. Sex workers are often the biggest victims of serial killers and mass murderers because they are more on the transient side. They're less, they're more marginalized, and it's easy, and their traces are more easily forgotten. But I think his murder and his vicious murder of particular types of women um, shows some sort of sadistic sexual impulses and urges that shows a disordered sex drive. I can't say much more than that. I love human behavior and psychology, and I think it's a huge part of history. And I love true crime stuff. But I don't know, and I think one of the reasons I don't know for sure is that we don't know who Jack the Ripper was. What makes Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer extraordinarily interesting is that we don't know who they are. We know Berkowitz, we know Manson, we know all of these people. We've been able to study them and create very deep profiles on them through the decades, but we don't know who these other people actually are. Interesting. John Richard Pilger. I'll have to look him up. Yeah. Was Antiochus involved in Alexander's murder? White Widow. Um, no. I'm trying to think which Antiochus the first. The man who or Antiochus. Are you thinking of Antiochus the fourth, the guy from the story of Hanukkah? No. I don't know who murdered Alexander. I don't know exactly how he died. Nobody knows exactly how he died. He had a son, but in the power vacuum, his son was very young, and the generals were able to divide it. And Seleucus is the one who set up a kingdom in Syria, Palestine, and the Middle East that became the biggest one in Anatolia, known as the Seleucid Empire. And it was the Seleucids who eventually set up the Antiochuses who set up the kingdoms in Syria and Israel, which eventually Antiochus IV is defeated in the Jewish revolt, which of course leads to the celebration of Hanukkah. Yeah, Paris is incredible. Was Alexander's eunuch BF a real person? Yeah, I've often told people that a lot of people wonder, well, why didn't Alexander just give it to his son? And it's true, his son, he did have a son, he was very young, but Alexander, like many Greeks, especially at that time, was not very interested in heterosexual relationships. And although there is significant evidence to say that Alexander was at least bisexual, I don't even think that I think Alexander the Great was asexual. I think if you could make up a word for being in love with warfare and having a sexual drive towards war and violence, Alexander the Great fits that bill. He was a conquering sexual, if you want to say that, basically. No, I'm so glad you're here, White Widow. I'm so glad to see you. And I think you're asking a great question. You're doing just what we do here on the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel. You drop in, you come in, you ask a question about social studies, history, you like and subscribe, becoming a friendly neighborhood historian, and all of that great stuff. That's what we do here every Friday and Saturday night. If you have a historical topic you want to ask about and you want to discuss it with me and with the chat, please drop it into the chat and I will do my best to answer it in a timely manner. It's what we do all the time. What questions? I don't. I appreciate that, Global, but I like to keep it one way. But I guess tell me what you had for dinner. Yes, Ahasuerus. So yeah, that's an interesting combination because you have two A named with very similar pronunciation leaders. Supposedly Ahasuerus, who might have been Artaxerxes, one of the emperor from the Battle of Thermopylae, who destroyed the Greeks there, supposedly was married to a Jewish woman, and her people were threatened with extinction in the Persian Empire by a man named Haman, and supposedly, I mean, this is the story according to the book of Esther in the Old Testament. But basically, Esther was able to save her people by revealing her Jewish identity. And so Ahasuerus, aka Artaxerxes, spared the Jewish people and killed Haman instead, who had been his top minister. So Ahasuerus is a Persian, Antiochus is a Greek, and there's about 300 years of difference. To celebrate their survival against the plots of Haman, and the beneficence of Artaxerxes and the bravery of Queen Esther, the Jews have created the holiday of Purim, where they basically it's basically a lot of people have compared it to Halloween. Jews tend to dress in costume. They have all sorts of celebrations, dancing and singing, and it's a holiday similar to Hanukkah in that it is about the survival of the Jewish people against an empire that could have possibly destroyed them. And if you look at the Passover Seder and the escape from Egypt, the Exodus story, if you look at the story of Purim and you look at the story of Hanukkah, at least in the traditional Jewish tellings of them based on their religious beliefs, survival, resistance, and the ability to overcome empire are essential to Jewish identity and existentialism. So, um, do a history quick fire quiz. No one's allowed to cheat or use Google. Okay, who became president after Lincoln? When Lincoln was shot, who became president? A. Andrew Jackson, B. Andrew Johnson, C. Ulysses S. Grant, D. Rutherford Hayes. There you go. Thank you. I was interested in the founder of a city which was Antioch that Bohemet captured. I'm not sure exactly who that is. Yes, it is Johnson, by the way. Is it true that croissants were made in the crescent shape because the early rising bakers had discovered the Ottomans at the gates of their city? Well, a croissant is French. The Ottomans never got that far. I wouldn't say that. It could be that crescents, at least another form of them in another city, could have happened. I have heard a story about that where they, this is similar once again to we're just talking about Passover to the Jewish concept of unleavened bread. The reason the bread was unleavened in the story in the book of Exodus and is unleavened to this day, the reason Jews do not use yeast during Passover, Pesach, is because the yeast rises and it takes time, and you're supposed to be ready to get out of there as soon as possible and leave at a moment's notice, so you don't have time to bake bread. You don't have time for your yeast to rise and all of that stuff. How do you know that a historical fact actually happened and not fabricated? I think that's a great question. So do you have a consensus? So typically what I tend to do is I tend to think, do we have a consensus about the history around this? Is this a generally accepted historical knowledge that is based on different are there multiple accounts who say these certain things? It is true that Winston Churchill navigated Great Britain through World War II, but do the Germans say that, who were his enemies? If you can get a consensus along several different perspectives from several different sides, you can actually find, I think that's the best way to do it. Now, in ancient history, it's much harder to do. You're going off of oral tradition that was eventually passed down. So I think all ancient history, to one extent or another, has to be taken with a grain of salt, and it's a piecemeal thing. And this is where art is so important, because with ancient history in particular, and even with modern history, we use art as a way to tell us the story of how people lived and what they did. The earliest writings in ancient Sumeria from 4000, 3500 BC, we have all thought would be these amazing historical and religious chronicles that would tell us so much. They're bank ledgers and banknotes. Those don't tell us a lot, but piecing them together, we find out how people lived, and we can make certain guesses about the way they lived. In prehistory, we use archaeology to be able to determine certain historical trends and events. So, for instance, the occurrence of a particular type of metal or material and tool in one town, in one area, as opposed to another town in another area, shows us some sort of connection of possible trade thousands of years before human beings were writing, during the Neolithic foundings of the early and Mesolithic foundings of the earliest cities and towns. So we put things together and we work through them a bit at a time. And the more modern we get, the more we have the ability to corroborate sources from different perspectives, and we rely on art, architecture, things like this to give us a general trend. And that's why I was talking with Running Man earlier about the importance of studying different religions and cultures, because those will actually tell us exactly why historical things happen. So because of a certain particular cultural or religious or ethnic belief, we can assume that they would act in a certain way. So we know that it makes a lot of sense for the Europeans to colonize Africa, because the cultural trend is that many of the African people speak the languages and have cultural practices that would come from no one else but these Europeans who spoke that language. At the same time, a common cultural belief was social Darwinism at the time, which said that they had the obligation to civilize these people who they believed were inferior, and they used that as justification for imperialization. So imperialism makes sense from that perspective, and so we can believe pretty reliably that these areas were colonized. You also have the ability of the Europeans to say, yes, we colonized these areas, and for the Africans who chafed under them to say, we were colonized by these aggressive Europeans. So, interesting. I'll have to check that out, Simon. I love historical. No, plug anyone you want. We share and share alike. I'm not a zero-sum YouTuber, but I love hearing about that. Different types of food and things. Yummy. We try to be the best. Oh, Bohemond. Yes. So in the First Crusade, that would be that they captured Antioch and Bohemond set up Antioch as a Christian city. Yeah, we look at the past. Science. Well, I wouldn't even say that science is aimed at the future. Science is aimed at discovering things in the present. I don't know if I would say that necessarily. I would say politics is aimed at the future. The photo of a napalm girl running down the road helped change perception. Yes, and the guy shooting the Vietnamese monk. Well, something that a lot of people don't understand is that the Tet Offensive was actually an American victory. Despite these surprise attacks from the Viet Cong, they were actually totally demoralized, and the Americans were able to defeat them. But media and press attention about how and depictions of how the war was so brutal and awful turned people against themselves. It's also the self-immolating monk, which don't look that up if you want a pleasant evening. But if it's going to be a little difficult to watch. Yeah. Is it true that Lincoln wasn't particularly interested in stopping slavery? Christopher Hitchens wrote about this, that it was part of a deal for peace, but not like, no. Hitchens is wrong. There's a lot of political strategy in Lincoln, and Lincoln was an excellent politician. And the Republican Party was not the abolitionist party. It was set up in the 1850s of Whigs and Northern Democrats who didn't like slavery. And while many of them had personal abolitionist convictions, many of them believed that the best way to defeat slavery was to choke it out from the inside, which, by the way, many of the founding fathers, even the slaveholding founding fathers, had believed in. So Lincoln, for instance, believed that the best thing to do was to basically let slavery choke itself out. By banning slavery in the new territories and confining it to the South, he believed that that would economically cripple the South to the point where they would have no choice but to stop slavery for their own economic pursuits. Lincoln wasn't, and when the Civil War started, the main thing was stopping secession and holding the Union together because they had left the Union. And a lot of people said, see, that proves that Lincoln wasn't trying to stop slavery. Well, wait a minute here. The reason they were trying to stop they left the Union was because they believed Lincoln would take away their slaves. Lincoln did say that he didn't want to free the slaves if it meant keeping the Union together. However, he realized as the war went on that defeating the South meant destroying their infrastructure, like he did with General Sherman in the March to the Sea, in which he burned Atlanta and a bunch of other places. But also it meant destroying the old way of life of the Southerners. That slavery was such an ingrained diseased tooth in the mouth of the nation that it would have to be removed brutally and by force, and it would have to go down to the roots, and the roots were slavery. So people who argue that the Civil War wasn't about slavery don't actually understand that. One of my first videos ever, we talked about the history of this channel, was about the lost cause myth, the idea that the Southerners were fighting a lost cause against Northern oppression, the War of Northern Aggression, as the Confederacy called it. But if you actually look at it and study it, you find out that's not true. They said, oh, they were culturally different. Why? Because of slavery. They wanted states' rights so they could keep their slaves so the federal government couldn't take away their slaves. Every single argument for why the South seceded from the North in the Civil War has to come down to the big S word, to slavery. And Lincoln realized this, and he realized that the war had to have a moral case. And so he gave the Emancipation Proclamation to redirect the war's attention to slavery and to tell the British and the French, who were thinking of recognizing the Confederacy, you have no right to do this because you're supposed to be against slavery. These guys are enslavers. And so Lincoln actually gains the upper hand morally and politically by redirecting his attention towards slavery. In his personal life, he had nothing but the absolute abhorrent hatred for it, and he was an abolitionist in his heart, but he believed that that wasn't the way that you got rid of the practice. You couldn't just poof and get rid of it. You had to. It was a process, but Lincoln realized that that process was a savage and military one. So, ever happy? That's a great question. Um, Ben's here. Oh, Ben, hi, good to see you. Sonic the Hedgehog. Um, Yes, so we're taking down statues and this whole thing. So what do I think about that? Sonic, it's a great topic to bring up. And it's great to have you here. I hope you're still here, by the way. But basically, where do I stand on that whole issue? I don't think that we should take down statues of historical figures. I think we should build more ones of other historical figures that we don't talk about enough. But it would be hard for me to argue that we should have statues to terrible people. Jefferson Davis doesn't deserve a statue. He didn't do anything particularly important. Robert E. Lee, I can see because Lee was extremely successful in the Mexican-American War, which helped the United States gain California and the Southwest. And Lee is probably America's greatest general. If he hadn't fought for the South, he would have been considered America's greatest general, better than Patton or Eisenhower. And Lincoln actually approached him to fight for the North, and Lee actually thought slavery was wrong, but because Virginia left the Union, he bought into the whole states' rights thing and fought for the Army of Northern Virginia as its leader. He is the only reason, in my opinion, or one of the main reasons, the Confederacy was able to stay in the war as long as they were. And if he fought for the Union, then the war would have been over very quickly, like they believed that would be at the beginning. Both sides believed the war would be over by the end of 1861. And every nasty major war in history, everybody thinks it's going to be over in a few months. Just the way it goes. But basically, yes, I don't think you can take down statues of somebody just because they weren't historically squeaky clean, because no one is historically squeaky clean. But I think there are better examples of statues than not. But when people are targeting statues of George Washington and Frederick Douglass, they may need to learn some history there. These guys were not perfect, but no one is perfect. You are living by standards that that no one can possibly reach, even yourself. So we need to be careful about tearing down statues. I think you can tear us down a statue of Stonewall Jackson. He believed that he was chosen by God to help uphold slavery, and I think that's abhorrent. But do we learn about him? And people don't learn from statues, by the way. People can read a plaque and learn a little bit, even at a museum, but people learn by reading and in-depth research and stuff like that. So I'm going to try to get through all the questions. We haven't had a huge crowd here tonight, so I've enjoyed the intimate nature of this. It feels very cozy for the Friday after Christmas. So yes, um, yeah. I don't think it takes 30 years. I think history is an ongoing process, and I think technically the 2020 election, COVID-19, which is still going on, those things are the COVID pandemic, the lockdowns. Those are all history. Those have already. Well, the reason I did political videos on this channel, if you want to learn about a historian's perspective on the 2024 election, check out my playlist about the U.S. political election of 2024. Was because I knew it was historical, and I didn't want to be waiting around 5 years or even 30 years to start talking about it. I want to talk about it right away because I knew history was being made in front of our eyes. So let's see here. The self-immolating. Might have said that wrong. You see, Cub, but self-immolating, basically setting himself on fire. Let me see. There were many returning. There are many returning to states with stories of failure. You are Webster's mate. I don't know what you mean. If you mean I'm like a dictionary, I really appreciate that. I'll take that as a compliment. Let me see here. What is your favorite subject era, politics, warfare, historically? Oh boy. Again, my emphasis is European history, particularly Eastern European history and Russian history in the more modern period. So I'm well versed in that. But basically, whenever I'm learning about a particular historical topic, I enjoy it. I tend to try to consider myself a historical chameleon. I was just talking about this, that history that I learn about even more recently, like I've been learning more about Asian and Eastern history, just fascinates me because history is about humans. Um, Yes, and I'm planning to put more of my work on Substack, by the way. So please follow us on Substack, Neighbor Friendly History. It's easy to find me on Substack. I think the link was posted in the chat by by Simon, my wonderful moderator. Show him some love, by the way. But basically, I'm trying to give people access to interact with my information there. And I'll be putting up blogs and personal writings and things like that. And yes, I'm planning to put my master's thesis there so you guys can all read and take and enjoy it. Yep. And there's the link. Thank you so much. Yes, that would be the gates of Vienna, which was attacked many times and threatened many times. And it was actually the Polish under King Jan Sobieski, who was one of their biggest heroes, John III, who defeated I did a video on this, who defeated the Ottomans and actually liberated the Habsburgs from the Ottomans in 1683. In the 17th century, Poland and Sweden were two of the most powerful countries in Europe. And a century later, Sweden was in decline, and Poland was divided by the Russians and the Prussians and the Austrians. Just to show you how history, a lot can change in 100 years. Yeah, the French fries are made with the Belgium. Do all roads lead to the same place? Asking for a friend. Well, you're thinking of all roads lead to Rome because the ancient Roman infrastructure was so sound that if you went on a road, you could connect to another road that could get you to Rome. Not all of the roads technically went to Rome, but you could easily get to Rome from one of the roads to another. Um, but no, not all roads lead to the same place, and not all who wander are lost. Um, Yes, that's that's true. He was Scottish, as were many of the Southerners. In fact, there is a lot of argumentation culturally and socially that the development of Southern culture that impacted African Americans was because many of the Southerners came from England, Scotland, and Ireland and had a very different work ethic and approach to the world than people from Southern England who were more likely to settle the Northern colonies. So there was a cultural and social difference in the way the South was founded by these Irish and Scottish and Northern English people, as opposed to people from Southern England and Wales who settled the Middle and Northern colonies, which is why those regions developed differently and are still different to this day, not just because of slavery. Um, Nicholas, hey, how are you doing? I'm good. Argentinian. Have you seen anything about Javier Milei? Do you have any opinion about him and his policies? So I try not to give my political opinions and stuff. I find Milei to be a fascinating character. He is a historical anomaly. He is the world's first official self-declared libertarian president. And he is a huge shift for the Argentinian people who have been more or less in bed with austerity and more liberal economic policies, left-wing policies, and socialistic policies for a long time. And he's basically just promised literally carrying a chainsaw around to slash it. He's one of the most eccentric political figures in the world today, and I'm sure people will be reading about him in history books in the next couple of decades. He has a very interesting personal life. He was a TV star and radio personality who decided to run for president and surprisingly won. I think similar to Trump in 2016, especially, he didn't think he was going to win. He was there to make a point, but now he is making his point. He is one of the most effective at getting his policies and ideas across, and he wants to fulfill his campaign pledges. One thing that I find interesting about his character was he flew in to the World Economic Forum not on a private plane as he was wont to as one of the leaders of the world, but on a commuter plane, and stood up and touted basic right wing economic policies, which are not very common there, anyways. So I think he's an extraordinarily interesting character. I think he's bold. I think he's daring. I think he's eccentric. But he's terraforming Argentina. And Argentina is going to be very significantly, at least socially and economically, different after Milei is president. And he seems to be popular from what I have heard. He is also, speaking of Judaism and the different religions there, he's also in Argentina, of all places, a very committed Jew, very interested in Orthodox Judaism and things like that. Baal from Germany, great to see you. So we've got somebody from Germany and we've got somebody from Argentina. I love having people from all over the world. It's a lot of fun. Yes, let me see. Edinburgh. I would love to go to Edinburgh. I love Scotland. It's for me, Scotland. I love all of England. I think England is wonderful. If I didn't live in the United States, I would live somewhere in Great Britain. But I think Scotland might be the prettiest area in Great Britain, my opinion. Um, so surrender the flag. Could you be your? Huh, that's funny. Yes, White Widow. What redneck culture actually develops? Some sociologists have argued from the Northern English, Scottish, and Irish that were wont to settle that region of the world, and even the large plantation and antebellum system was developed by redneck cracker culture from Northern England and Scotland, which was far more rowdy, far more vindictive. Lynching was common in Northern England. People in Scotland and Ireland did not know how to read or write English as opposed to their European English counterparts, even in the 1600s. So there was a lot less educational access. There was a far more vindictive culture, a far more violent culture that emerged and was carried over to the South. So lynching was actually most victims of lynching, especially especially before the American. Most victims of lynching early on were white, and lynching was not created to kill black slaves. It was actually a carryover from Angloid culture in Northern England and Scotland. Yeah, Argentina is huge. It's beautiful. Nicholas, I appreciate it. I try to give as best of my objective opinion as possible. And if you want to hear me talk about politics and stuff like that, go and watch my videos on the 2024 election and on all of that. And there is a large community of Ashkenazi Jews. There are over 2 million Italian immigrants migrated to Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th century. And a lot of people say that the only Europeans in South America are Nazis and fascists from Italy. There are some descendants of those people, but there are huge amounts of Italians. I mean, one of my favorite basketball players growing up was Manu Ginobili, an Italian surname. Malay is an Italian. He has blue eyes. I mean, not exactly Argentinian or Latin, but has definitely become part of that culture several generations in. Um, well, I wouldn't say we. I wouldn't blame anyone in particular. I'd say that's a cultural phenomenon, white widow, that you see in England, in the northern parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, that is carried over into American Southern culture that develops very differently than the Puritan culture of the North. What was the Bronze Age? So, C-Dub, the Bronze Age was a period where bronze, basically, it's interesting. People like to name their eras after the technology they use. So we are in the digital information or computer age, whatever you want to call it. But the Bronze Age was when bronze became the predominant metal that was used, uh, fusing tin and copper together rather than using stone, and it replaced stone as the most common metal used. And the Bronze Age, there were several parts of it. It was very common. It's when the Egyptians were developing their system. There was even a copper age before then, but the Bronze Age is pretty predominant, and it's when the Egyptians and the Hittites and uh, developed their civilizations and empires in the ancient Near East, and then iron becomes the replacement of that around, I think, 1600 BC. So that's the Bronze Age. Uh, Let me see here. Yeah, I'm not good at dancing or charades, so I'm gonna have to pass on that. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's that's a simple, quick answer from a historian on YouTube. The Bronze Age is an extremely complex time where you have a development of many different technologies, such as sea trade and seafaring. You have a development of bronze weapons and tools, and you have a development of these civilizations and kingdoms that I was talking about earlier. Um, no, I haven't played those. I have played Rome Total War though, and I really, really like that game. So anyways, I finally caught up to the chat. We're 75 minutes in, so despite the fact that we didn't have a huge crowd tonight, we got through a huge amount of the questions, which I really appreciate and enjoyed when we're able to do that. So we're going to stop there. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate everybody bringing up multiple topics, having great questions. I was worried that we wouldn't have enough, but we always get through. The oil in the lamp lasted for 8 days, and the questions in the chat lasted for an hour and 15 minutes. And why did Nero set fire? He might have, he might not have. It's dubious historical information. We don't have a lot of corroboration, like I talked about earlier, as a way of knowing that history. But it's very, very possible that he did that to rebuild a palace. That's the rumor. But those were written by historians who hated him later on. And yeah, we're going to be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please join us. And Sunday's lecture, I'm thinking about doing the history of Hanukkah, Simon, but I've talked about that so much on the channel. I'm not 100% sure. If anyone has a historical topic they want me to talk about for Sunday's lecture, drop it in the chat or bring it up tomorrow. And I might just want to do that. That would be a lot of fun. But we will be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern for another hour of questions and answers. Ask me anything. Tell all your friends and families. Like and subscribe. Become a friendly neighborhood historian. Oh, C-Dub, I think we have a winner. Two smaller subjects. Well, if I do the French Revolution, that's going to take an hour. I don't know. I don't do a lot of a history of New Year because there's New Year's all over the place. I mean, you have Rosh Hashanah, you have Samhain, you have all of these different practices, but we could do the French Revolution. That would just be a full hour. But I think I've done the French Revolution on a live stream lecture before, but I'm willing to do an updated version of that if we don't hear anything else. But yeah, I'm going to sleep on it. Thank you so much for joining us and all of your questions. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern. Oh, Mike, great to see you. Sorry you're joining us at the very end, but it's always great to see you anyways. Um, like and subscribe, and we will see you tomorrow, 7 p.m. for another hour of this Q&A. So join us then. Follow us on social media. Check out that Substack. My article on the Boxing Day and the history of one of the most popular holidays that you probably don't know about. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. Take care and have a great night. Show some love to Simon. Simon, always a pleasure. You do such a great job, and we appreciate you so much here. This is the Friendly Neighborhood History Channel signing off, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.